So right, aims of a philosophy paper and what does it do? So this is the list that I've taken from Jim Pryor. This is a media source that is on the course. It's in the objective of the previous week. And so I'll read the 9, and I have some examples of, I think, the more interesting 6 or 7 of them briefly. So the first is to criticize the argument that you are discussing. So you can take Descartes and just say his argument doesn't work. Or you can show that some arguments for the broader thesis don't contribute to that thesis. The second you can do is to defend the argument or thesis against someone else's criticism. You can offer reasons to believe the thesis. You can offer counterexamples to the thesis, which is a critical stance again. You can contrast the strengths and weaknesses of 2 opposing views about a thesis. So here's your compare and contrast kind of paper. You can give examples which help explain the thesis, or which help to make the thesis more plausible. You can argue that certain philosophers are committed to the thesis by their own views, even though they have not come out and explicitly said so. You can discuss what consequences the thesis would have if it were true. And then lastly, you can revise the original thesis in the light of some objection. And so I will run through a few of these now. So the first is to revise the thesis in light of some objection. So for example, person A argues that B, and C argues that B is mistaken because of reasons D. And so you can say, yes, C, who argues against the original argument presented by A, is mistaken for other reasons. So here you have an argument, you have someone who critiques the argument, and then you offer a critique of the person who critiqued to say that their critique is unsuccessful. And so you defend an argument against another critic in this way. Hume said something, Locke disagreed with him, but I think Locke is wrong, and therefore Hume's argument stands. Offer reasons to believe the thesis. So here we can see that A argues that B because of C. A is right, but also because of D. So you offer new reasons to support the original argument. So you can say Descartes has the argument for I think, therefore I am. His argument is convincing. And there's another argument he could have made for the same conclusion that supports him that he didn't make, but I can offer that argument. And so in this way, you just support him, or you support the argument, but for other reasons. So Susan says socialism is good because it counters the effect of luck on our life chances. Susan's argument that socialism is good is a persuasive argument. I accept her thesis. And there are other reasons to support socialism that she has not mentioned. And then my project will be presenting those reasons, showing why she is correct, and also why my reasons would make her argument even stronger. The next one is that you can offer counterexamples to the thesis. So A argues that B, and then I can show that A's argument does not work because of example E. And here I can, again, stick with Susan, who says that socialism is good because it counters the effect of luck on our life chances. But then I could say, look at the social democratic country of Norway, where X, Y, and Z happens. These do not support, this actual example does not support Susan's argument. And for this actual example, I can show that it undermines Susan's argument for socialism. You can also give examples which help explain the thesis, or which help to make the thesis more plausible. This is, again, not a criticism of the thesis. And so A argues that B. Example C shows how this could work. Quite often, the work done in philosophy is incredibly abstract. And then if you can come up with a very good example which clarifies the thesis, and then you'd make the argument that this is a good example of Hume's position. And so you're still, of course, making an argument through all of these examples, just not necessarily critical. So Susan says socialism is good because it counters the effect of luck on our life chances. And then I can have an example or a thought experiment. Imagine three people with the same talents, born into different social strata, with wildly differing opportunities, etc., etc., etc. And then you can say, this is a great thought experiment or an actual example, if you can find one, for why Susan's argument is persuasive. This is an interesting take that personally I quite like to use. It's a little bit of an entrapment, I think, but it's quite fun if you can pull it off. So you can argue that certain philosophers are committed to the thesis by their own views, though they do not come out and explicitly endorse this thesis, which takes the form of A argues that B, and someone else, C, argues that D. But then you can say, if you support D, then you must support B. And so C actually agrees with A. That's a lot of letters. So Charlotte argues for the existence of a God because the universe is too complex not to be designed, says Charlotte. John, totally separate argument, says anything sufficiently complicated has a rational reason for being complicated. And then you can say, ooh, I got you, John. The universe is very complicated. There must be a rational reason for it, according to you, John. And so, John, you must believe, like Charlotte, in the existence of a God, even though you've never said that you do, because your two arguments align in this way. You're committed to Charlotte's view in your own view. And this is a way to sort of bootstrap one philosopher onto another. And you can even go against their own conclusions. Someone could be arguing for capitalism, and you can show that the reasons they've used to argue for capitalism are exactly the same reasons that Susan uses to argue for socialism. And then you can say, you're actually a socialist. You agree with Susan based on your argument. You can discuss what consequences thesis would have if it were true. So A argues that B, and then you can make the argument that if B is true, then, etc., etc. So John Stuart Mill argues that only consequences can dictate the moral worth of an action. So we only take consequences into effect. And you can say, okay, Mill is good. His argument is persuasive. I can't find any logical issue with it. Great argument. I do have a concern with the argument, though, and that is that if this argument is true, and this is how we develop our moral world, then really it's going to be those who do really morally reprehensible acts who will make sure that they don't get caught. And so we're just going to encourage people to work even harder not to get caught. Because if there's no negative consequence, then it's not a bad act. And here I mean something like the classic example of the person who spies on their neighbor while the neighbor is in some compromised position. The only negative consequence here is if the neighbor finds out that they have been spied on. Before that point, there's no negativity. If someone steals from you and you never realize that you've been stolen from, not a problem. And so I can say the argument is great. The argument convinces me, but the consequences of the argument are such that I cannot accept this argument for other reasons. You can revise a thesis in the light of some objection to the thesis. And so this is not a full-on critique that someone is wrong, but you just offer a revision. It's the much more modest position. And you can say that A argues that B because of C. But then you can argue that B starred is actually a better conclusion because C starred. And so you can say, Descartes argues that I think, therefore I am. And you can say, yeah, Descartes is definitely on the right track. This is a good direction to argue. His work is formidable, but it's slightly more accurate to conclude something like, thinking happens Therefore, a conscious I seems to be associated with thinking happening. And so you've just made a little bit of a weaker claim, but maybe there is some challenge about the kind of rational subject that Descartes depends upon, and you want to avoid that challenge. And so you say, we can just revise this claim, soften it a bit, based on revised reasons. And not that Descartes is wrong. He was on the right track. His argument was good. He just was a bit too ambitious, perhaps. And so we've just reworked his conclusion. And there we are.